And this is why understanding why we tell stories, the only reason we tell stories, matters. If your stories don't create trust and connection in support of the one big idea, in support of the one idea, in support of the one topic that you're sharing, then they have to go. And once you wrap your head around that, then I can guarantee you that your storytelling is going to go to the next level and you are going to see engagement like you've never seen before. Welcome to episode 20 on the Speaker Driven Business Podcast. This is where we're going to actually really start to break down some of the specific skills that you need to get whatever you want through the power of your spoken word content. My entire mission with creating the Speaker Driven Business Podcast is to get the skills and the knowledge and the knowing into as many people as possible. I believe when we understand the true power of speaking and the true power of storytelling, that we can and should change the world. But actually building the skills to get there is a whole different thing to wanting it. And so that's why we've created this platform and this podcast so that I can have the conversations with you to get what I've learned to be true about speaking and storytelling into the hands of as many people as possible. But it's no good just to have this esoteric thinking and these positionings and these 7 mistakes and 9 habits and all the rest of it. We actually need to be able to unpack all of the core elements of being able to speak powerfully, being able to speak with strength, power, and grace, being able to go after and get whatever we want through the power of our spoken word content. And so in episode 19, we spoke about the structures that come with our speaking that underpin how we can actually deliberately move people from one to the next. And now we're going to shift into really deep diving into storytelling. Because if you remember in episode 19, when I spoke about the structures, I spoke about, particularly with our keynotes, I spoke about the fact that, basically a third is pure story. And we obviously do use stories in other places as well, but stories are the most powerful entry point for anyone coming into our spoken world. Now, when we Google the importance of storytelling, like how important is storytelling in communication, Dr. Google will come back with, I think it's something like 1.3 billion hits within 0.62 of a second. Now, what that means is that there are endless oceans of resources out there about storytelling and why it's so important and how you tell a great story and all that sort of stuff. And so I only have one question for you if you're listening to me, is if that's the case, if Google is bringing us back more than 1 billion resources of articles, frameworks, thinking, ideas, how-tos within less than a second, then why are we listening to so many bad storytellers? Why is it that most of us don't actually know how to tell a good story? Why is it that so many times we turn up in a room and literally walk out thinking about the speaker going, yeah, great guy, but God, that's time I'm never going to get back in my life, right? Why is it that we have so many bad storytellers if we actually know how important it is? Well, there's a few things. One is that in this era of raw and real and this all holds barred authenticity, which we do need to be authentic. Don't get me wrong. We'll talk about that a lot more. But in this real and raw era, we actually have this wave of storytellers coming through who are really self-indulgent. And whilst we do need to share our stories and whilst we do need to share the power of our lived and worked experience, we actually need to show those and share those stories in a way that is in service to others. Right? So the mistakes that we see, the bad stories that we see come from self-indulgence. They come from rambling, from really not being able to pull it in tight. They come from bringing in too much detail and not enough detail, but being all over the place because, like so many people tell me, I'm okay, I just wing it and I'm fantastic. But your stories need to be really powerful and not ramble. They need to actually land what it is that you want to say, and the stories need to be in service to your audience, and the filters we use need to be from the blue apple. So that's the first 2 mistakes, being self-indulgent and rambling. The second one is where we purely narrate or we purely immerse. Now, what I'm going to speak about that is when we purely narrate, we become like a broadcast journalist. And when we purely narrate, it's like we're one step removed. And what happens with that is when we're one step removed, we're actually giving our audience permission to also be one step removed. So purely narrating is no good. I remember years ago working with a broadcast journalist who wanted to step into professional speaking. Now, at that stage, and she has gone on to become an incredible professional speaker, but at that stage, she was still in broadcast journalism mode. And every time she spoke, we could not get her out of narrative mode. And what it meant was the first couple of times that she delivered as a speaker and not as a broadcast journalist personality, she got slammed because she stayed purely in narration mode. And when we stay purely in narration mode, people feel like you're wasting our time. People feel like you're not telling everything. People feel like they can't connect to you. It's also, though, important not to spend 100% of your time immersed. So when I say that immersed, I mean unfolding a story as if it's happening now. You actually in the story, sharing all of it, sharing what you know to be true. We can't actually stay 100% in immersion. So we actually have to have this rhythm created between narration and immersion to give our stories full form and to make them really good. But bear in mind, you will have more chance of success if you're 100% in immersion than if you're 100% in narration like my previous client. The fourth mistake that we make when we're telling stories is that we think we need to be the hero. And some of this has been predicated because of our obsession with the hero's journey in storytelling. That obsession is well-founded. It is the oldest and the most powerful way of telling a story on the planet. But in doing so, and particularly combined with the real and raw movement, we actually mistakenly believe that when we take to the front of the room that we should be the hero. We're going to talk more about the hero's journey in episodes to come, but you actually need to stop being the hero and step into being the guide. And the other mistake we see with storytelling is negligent lived experience. Now, this happens, I'm going to be very careful not to get on a rant here because this is really close to my heart. This happens particularly with charities and movements or in real and raw conversations, things like fuck up nights, things like the authentic experiences of founders and, as I said, charities and movements. And what happens with these is what I call negligent lived experience is not that we shouldn't share our lived experience, but in this era of real and raw and lived experience being more openly discussed, we've actually gone a little too far. And in doing so, we are so real and raw and we take people so far into those worlds that we actually trigger our audiences. Now, trigger is not a word that I like, but it's true. We actually go so far into this story that people with a similar experience actually go back into that personal story for them. It is not a healthy place to be. You can tell the biggest, most dramatic, most trauma-based story in a way that is in service to the audience, right? But if you don't take the time to do that, then this is what I call negligent lived experience, not inspirational lived experience. So those are the mistakes that we see, some of the mistakes we see with bad storytelling. We are self-indulgent in an effort to be real and raw. We are rambling. We narrate 100% narrate or 100% immerse. We are being the hero, or we are telling our lived experience in a way that is negligent for our audience. The other thing that actually combines both the first and the last of those is that we see so many people doing therapy from stage. We have a mantra in our organization and within our community that until we can speak to something with strength, power, and grace, it is not ours to speak to yet. And that's not that it's not ours to speak to ever. It's simply not ours to speak to yet. Now that strength and that power and that grace, it can absolutely have emotion. It can absolutely have the glimmer of tears. It can absolutely have the joys and the celebrations and the exhilaration. But we should never do therapy from stage because that's about us and not in service to our audience. And when we're doing therapy from stage, we can take people into places to understand, but we very rarely are able to bring them back out of it. And that's where strength, power, and grace becomes our benchmark, because once we can speak to something with strength, power, and grace, we not only take people into something, we are able to bring people out. So that's all well and good about why storytelling is important, the fact that even Dr. Google recognizes it, the mistakes that we see, and why we tell bad stories. But what is the reason we actually are telling stories? Yes, it's to share experience. Yes, it's to actually create, a feeling that we know what we're speaking about. Yes, it's to, to show and to validate that our experience matters. But the main reason why we tell stories, and this is really hard for people to get their head around, the only reason we actually tell stories is to create trust and connection. Peter Guber, in his book, Tell to Win, talks about the fact that the fastest way to go from me to we is through story, even in pitching, even in multi-hundreds of $1,000,000 deals. The fastest way to go from me to we is to tell story, is through story. Story is meant to create trust. It's meant to create connection. It's meant to open people up. One of the reasons that we tell story is that we want to actually bring down the 5-year-old gatekeeper. And I'm going to talk to you more and more about this. The 5-year-old gatekeeper is actually, if you think about this, between your conscious mind and unconscious mind, between head and heart, we are wanting to move people between those two as a speaker. We want people to drop from their conscious mind to their unconscious mind. We want people to drop from their head to their heart. But between head and heart, between conscious and unconscious, is a 5-year-old gatekeeper. And I want you to think about this 5-year-old gatekeeper. Think about when a 5-year-old child doesn't get their own way. Think about what happens. They throw a tantrum. They get upset. They scream and shout. They stomp their feet. And the only way to get through to them is to actually slow down, speak to them in their language, and logic and reason doesn't work. We actually have to tell stories, even if it's micro stories. This is actually why fairy tales were written, because fairy tales land important values-based lessons for children without actually screaming and shouting at them. So this 5-year-old gatekeeper exists in everybody's mind. It exists, and if we want to get from the conscious to the unconscious, from the head to the heart, we have to bring that 5-year-old gatekeeper down. And the only way to do that is through storytelling. This is the only way that we can create trust. We create trust and connection through telling stories that actually allow our audiences to feel like they are being seen. We don't tell stories for people to say, I like you. We tell stories for people to say, oh, you are like me. And when we can master that, then we become masterful storytellers. And then we won't be in the realm of bad storytelling. There are some of the things that I want to share with you as well before we do close this episode and this conversation out. And that is that storytelling, even for the most database driven people on the planet, even for research people, stories must come into it. There are different ways that we do it. And what I want you to think about is that the printing press was only invented, I think, in the 1400s. Before that, there were scribes and there were privileged people who were able to write books and to communicate through letter writing. And before that, everything was around story. So it's only in the last 400 to 500 years of civilization that we've actually had another way of passing on knowledge other than just sharing of our story. And yet there are some things that we know to be true that have been handed down through the ancients, through the wisdom of the ancients. And that has only been through storytelling. That has only been through capturing story. This is why story is important. The other thing which ties into my comment earlier about we need to be able to speak with strength, power, and grace is that our stories should surprise and delight and intrigue. They should not shock and horrify. Even the most traumatic and dramatic of stories should have an element of intrigue and surprise rather than shock and horrify. When you can learn to tell your stories in that way, then your stories will actually land a lot faster and you'll get people stepping in beside you a lot quicker. We also use stories so we can land our expertise and we can land our credentials, if you like, without screaming them out. There's nothing worse than sitting through the opening of a story or opening of a speech and somebody's rattling off their credentials. Somebody is showing all of their television show appearances. Someone is telling you all the things that they've studied. Someone is name dropping all the way through. We want you to be able to use story to engage, to create that trust and connection, to bridge from me to we without having to scream your credentials. Landing stories in such a way that people sit there and go, yeah, I get you. I understand you. I can trust you. I'm going to give you my full attention. And in doing so, in all of us getting to this point, what is going to happen as we unfold stories over this next few conversations is that you're going to come to realize that sometimes you may have to kill your favorite children. And by this, I don't mean your literal children, but I mean your favorite stories, your go-to stories. Because the last thing you want to be is like Uncle Bob sitting in the corner telling the same story over and over again, because for once in the year, he's got a captive audience. right? And it's not that we won't repeat our stories, but we need to make sure our stories are relevant. Because when Uncle Bob goes into that storytelling mode, you can guarantee every kid around him wants to get out as fast as they can. And most of the adults as well. You don't want to be Uncle Bob when it comes to your storytelling. We actually, in one of our rooms a few years ago, we had a very experienced speaker turn up, and he knew our emphasis on storytelling. And he also already knew one of the techniques that we use to get all of our best stories out on the table. And so he turned up with his list of stories to match that. And I kept saying to him, I think you're going to have to kill them off. And he was like, no, these are my stories. These are my stories. And so on the first night, in between day 1 and day 2, we challenge our people to go away and pressure test their story ideas against the blue apple. Now, when he came back into the room the next day, he was actually laughing and also exasperated because he'd realized when he applied the blue apple that all the stories he'd chosen, the 10 stories he'd chosen to bring into the room, only one of them was going to work. And this is why understanding why we tell stories, the only reason we tell stories, matters. If your stories don't create trust and connection in support of the one big idea, in support of the one idea, in support of the one topic that you're sharing, then they have to go. And once you wrap your head around that, then I can guarantee you that your storytelling is going to go to the next level and you are going to see engagement like you've never seen before.